This is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Chapter 1 A Shifting Reef. The year 1866 was signalized by a remarkable incident, a mysterious and puzzling phenomena, which doubtless no one has yet forgotten. Not to mention rumors which agitated the maritime population and excited the public mind. Even in the interior of continents, seafaring men were particularly excited. Merchants, common sailors, captains of vessels, skippers, both of Europe and America, naval officers of all countries, and the government of several states on the two continents were deeply interested in the matter. For some time past, vessels have been met by an enormous thing, quote unquote, a long object, spindle-shaped, occasionally phosphorescent, and infinitely larger and more rapid in its movements than a whale. The facts relating to this apparition, entered in various logbooks, agreed in most respects as to the shape of the object or creature in question. In the untiring rapidity of its movements, its surprising power of locomotion, and the peculiar life with which it seemed endowed. If it was a whale, it surpassed in size all those hitherto classified in science. Taking into consideration the mean of observations made at diverse times, rejecting the timid estimate of those who assigned to this object a length of 200 feet, equally with the exaggerated opinions which set it down as a mile in width and 3 in length, we might fairly conclude that this mysterious being surpassed greatly all dimensions admitted by the learned ones of the day, if it existed at all. And that it did exist was an undeniable fact. And with that tendency which disposes the human mind in favor of the marvelous, we can understand the excitement produced by the entire world by this supernatural apparition. As to classing it in the list of fables, the idea was out of the question. On July 20, 1866, the steamer Governor Higginson of the Calcutta and Bernac Steam Navigation Company had met this moving mass 5 miles off the east coast of Australia. Captain Baker thought at first that he was in the presence of an unknown sandbank. He even prepared to determine its exact position when 2 columns of water projected by the mysterious object shot with a hissing noise 150 feet up into the air. Now, unless the sandbank had been submitted to the intermittent eruption, of a geyser, the Governor Higginson had to do neither more nor less than with an aquatic mammal, unknown till then, which threw up from its blowholes columns of water mixed with air and vapor. Similar facts were observed on July 23rd in the same year, in the Pacific Ocean by the Columbus of the West India and Pacific Steam Navigation Company. But this extraordinary creature could transport itself from one place to another with surprising velocity, as, in an interval of 3 days, the Governor Higginson and the Columbus had observed it at 2 different points of the chart, separated by a distance of more than 700 nautical leagues. 15 days later, 2,000 miles farther off, the Helvetia of the Compagnie Nationale and the Shannon of the Royal Mail Steamship Company sailing to windward, sailing to windward in that position, in that portion of the Atlantic lying between the United States and Europe, respectively signaling the monster to each other in 42 degrees 15 minutes north latitude and 60 degrees 35-minute west longitude. In these simultaneous observations, they thought themselves justified in estimating the minimum length of the mammal at more than 350 feet, as the Shannon and Helvetia were of smaller dimensions than it, though they measured 300 feet overall. Now the largest whale, those with frequent, now the largest whales, those which frequent these parts of the sea around the Aleutian, Calamac, and Umgulich Islands, have never exceeded the length of 60 yards, if they attained that. In every place of great resort, the monster was the fashion. They sang of it in the cafes, ridiculed it in the papers, and represented it on the stage. All kinds of stories were circulated regarding it. There appeared in the papers caricatures of every gigantic and imaginary creature, from the white whale, the terrible quote-unquote Moby Dick of subarctic regions, or the immense kraken whose tentacles could entangle a ship of 500 tons and hurry it into the abyss of the ocean. The legends of ancient times were even revived. Then burst forth the unending argument between the believers and the non-believers in the societies of the wise and the scientific journals. The question, quote, the question of the monster, unquote, the question of the monster, end quote, inflamed all minds. Editors of scientific journals, quarreling with believers in the supernatural, spilled seas of ink during this memorable campaign, some even drawing blood, for the sea serpent they came to direct personalities. For from the sea serpent they came to direct personalities. For 6 months war was waged with various fortune in the leading articles of the Geographical Institution of Brazil, the Royal Academy of Science in Berlin, the British Association, the Smithsonian Institution of Washington, in the discussion of the quote Indian archipelago, end quote, of the cosmos of the Abbe Moigno, in the Mythologen of Petermann, in the scientific chronicles of the great journals of France and other countries. The cheaper journals replied keenly and with exhaustible zest. These satirical writers parodied a remark of Linnaeus quoted by the adversaries of the monster, maintaining that nature did not make fools, and adjured their contemporaries not to give the lie to nature by admitting the existence of kraken, sea serpents, quote, Moby Dicks, unquote, and other lubrications of delirious sailors. At length, in an article in a well-known satirical journal by a favorite contributor, the chief of staff settled the monster like Hippolytus, giving it the death blow amid a universal burst of laughter. Wit had conquered science. During the first months of the year 1867, the question seemed buried, never to revive, when new facts were brought before the public. It was then no longer a scientific problem to be solved, but a real danger seriously to be avoided. The question, took quite another shape. The monster became a small island, a rock, a reef, but a reef of indefinite and shifting proportions. On March 5, 1867, the Moravian of the Montreal Ocean Company, finding herself during the night in 27 degrees 30 minutes latitude and 72 degrees 15 minutes longitude, struck on her starboard quarter a rock. Struck on her starboard quarter a rock marked in no chart for that part of the sea. Under the combined efforts of the wind and the 400 horsepower, it was going at the rate of 13 knots. Had it not been for the superior strength of the hull of the Moravian, she would have been broken by the shock and gone down with 237 passengers she was bringing home from Canada. The accident happened about 5 o'clock in the morning. As the day was breaking, the officers of the quarterdeck hurried to the after part of the vessel. They examined the sea with the most careful attention. They saw nothing but a strong eddy about 3 cables' length distance, as if the surface had been violently agitated. The bearing of the place were taken exactly, and the Moravian continued its route without apparent damage. Had it struck on a submerged rock, or an enormous wreck, they could not tell, but on examination of the ship's bottom, when undergoing repairs, it was found that part of her keel was broken. This fact, so grave in itself, might perhaps have been forgotten like many others if 3 weeks after it had not been reenacted under similar circumstances. But thanks to the nationality of the victim of the shock, thanks to the reputation of the company to which the vessel belonged, the circumstance became extensively circulated. On April 13, 1867, the sea being beautiful, the breeze favorable, the Scotia, on the Cunard Company's line, found herself in 15 degree 12 minute longitude and 45 degree 37 minute latitude. She was going at the speed of 13 knots and a half. At 17 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, while the passengers were assembled at lunch in the great saloon, a slight shock was felt on the hull of the Scotia, on her quarter, a little aft of the port paddle. The Scotia had not struck, but she had been struck, and seemingly by something rather sharp and penetrating than blunt. The shock had been so slight that no one had been alarmed. Had it not been for the shouts of the carpenters watching, who rushed onto the bridge, exclaiming, "We are sinking! We are sinking!" At first the passengers were much frightened, but Captain Anderson hastened to reassure them. The danger could not be imminent. The Scotia, divided into 7 compartments by strong partitions, could brave with impunity any leak. Captain Anderson went down immediately into the hold, and found that the sea was pouring into the 5th compartment, and the rapidity of the influx proved that the force of the water was considerable. Fortunately, this compartment did not hold the boilers, or the fires would have been immediately extinguished. Captain Anderson ordered the engines to be stopped at once, and one of the men went down to ascertain the extent of the injury. Some minutes afterward they discovered the existence of a large hole, 2 yards in diameter, in the ship's bottom. Such a leak could not be stopped, and the Scotia, her paddles half submerged, was obliged to continue her course. She was then 300 miles from Cape Clear, and after 3 days' delay, which caused great uneasiness in Liverpool, she entered the basin of the company. The engineers visited the Scotia, which was put in dry dock. They could scarcely believe it possible. At 2.5 yards below watermark was a regular rent in the form of an isosceles triangle. The broken place in the iron plates was so perfectly defined that it could not have been more nearly done by a punch. It was clear, then, that the instrument producing the perforation was not of a common stamp, and after having been driven with prodigious strength, and piercing an iron plate 1 3/8 inches thick, had withdrawn itself by a backward motion. Such was the last fact, which resulted in exciting once more the torrent of public opinion. From this moment, all unlucky casualties which could not be otherwise accounted for were put down to the monster. Upon this imaginary creature rested the responsibility of all these shipwrecks, which unfortunately were considerable, for of 3,000 ships whose loss was annually recorded at Lloyd's, the number of sailing and steamships supposed to be totally lost, from the absence of all news, amounted to not less than 200. Now, it was the "monster" who, justly or unjustly, was accused of their disappearance, and thanks to it, communication between the different continents became more and more dangerous. The public demanded sharply that the seas should at any price be relieved from this formidable curtation. Citation. Chapter 2. Pro and Con. At the period where these events took place, I had just returned from a scientific research in the disagreeable territory of Nebraska in the United States. In virtue of my office as assistant professor in the Museum of Natural History in Paris, the French government had attached me to that expedition. After 6 months in Nebraska, I arrived in New York towards the end of March, laden with a precious collection. My departure for France was fixed for the first days in May. Meanwhile, I was occupying myself in classifying my mineralogical, botanical, and zoological riches when the accident happened to the Scotia. I was perfectly up in the subject, which was the question of the day. How could I be otherwise? I had read and reread all the American and European papers without being any nearer a conclusion. This mystery puzzled me. Under the impossibility of forming an opinion, I jumped from one extreme to the other. That there really was something could not be doubted, and the incredulous were invited to put their finger on the wound of the Scotia. On my arrival at New York, the question was at its height. The theory of the floating island and the unapproachable sandbanks, supported by minds little competent to form a judgment, was abandoned. And, indeed, unless this shoal had a machine in its stomach, how could it change its position with such astonishing rapidity? From the same cause, the idea of a floating hull of an enormous wreck was given up. There remained then only two possible solutions for the question, which created two distinct parties. On one side, those who were for a monster of colossal strength; on the other, those who were for a submarine vessel of enormous motive power. But this last theory, plausible as it was, could not stand against inquiries made in both worlds. That a private gentleman should have such a machine at its command was not likely. Where, when, and how was it built? And how could its construction have been kept secret? Certainly, a government might possess such a destructive machine, and in these disastrous times, when the ingenuity of man had multiplied the power of weapons of war, it was possible that without the knowledge of others, a state might try to work such a formidable engine. After the chase pots came the torpedoes. After the torpedoes, the submarine rams. Then the reaction. At least, I hope so. But the idea of a war machine fell before the declaration of governments. As public interest was in question, the transatlantic communication suffered. Their veracity could not be doubted. But how admit that the construction of this submarine boat had escaped the public eye? For a private gentleman to keep the secret under such circumstances would be very difficult, and for a state whose every act is persistently watching the powerful rivals, certainly impossible. Upon my arrival in New York, several persons did me the honor of consulting me on the phenomena in question. I had published in France a work in quarto in 2 volumes, entitled Mysteries of the Great Submarine Grounds. This book, highly approved of in the learned world, gained for me a special reputation in this rather obscure branch of natural history. My advice was asked. As long as I could deny the reality of the fact, I confined myself to a decided negative. But soon, finding myself driven into a corner, I was obliged to explain myself point by point. And even, quote, the Honorable Pierre Aronnax, professor in the Museum of Paris, end quote, was called upon by the New York Herald to express a definite opinion of some sort. I did something. I spoke for want of power to hold my tongue. I discussed the question in all its forms, politically and scientifically, and I give here an extract from a careful studied article which I published in the issue of April 30th. It ran as follows. Quote, after examining one by one the different theories, rejecting all other suggestions, it becomes necessary to admit the existence of a marine animal of enormous power. The great depths of the ocean are entirely unknown to us. Soundings cannot reach them. What passes in those remote depths, what beings live or can live 12 or 15 miles beneath the surface of the waters, what is the organization of these animals? We can scarcely conjecture. However, the solution of the problem submitted to me may modify the form of the dilemma. Either we do know all the varieties of being which people our planet or we do not. If we do not know them all, if nature has still secrets in the deep for us, nothing is more conformable to reason than to admit the existence of fish or crustaceans of other kinds, or even of new species, of an organization formed to inhabit the strata inaccessible to surroundings, and which an accident of some sort, either fantastical or capricious, has brought at long intervals to the upper level of the ocean. If, on the contrary, we do know all living kinds, we must necessarily seek for the animal in question among those marine beings already classed, and in that case I should be disposed to admit the existence of a gigantic narwhal. The common narwhal, or unicorn of the sea, often attains a length of 60 feet. Increase its size 5-fold or 10-fold, give it strength proportionate to its size, lengthen its destructive weapons, and you obtain the animal required. It will have the proportions determined by the officers of the Shannon. The instrument required by the perforations the instrument required by the perforation of the Scotia, and the power necessary to pierce the hull of the steamer. Indeed, the narwhal is armed with a sort of ivory sword, a halberd, according to the expression of certain naturalists. The principal task has the hardness of steel. Some of these tusks The principal tusk has the hardness of steel. Some of these tusks have been found buried in the bodies of whales, which the unicorn always attacks with success. Others had been drawn out, not without trouble, from the bottoms of ships, which they had pierced through and through, as a gimlet pierces a barrel. The Museum of the Faculty of Medicine of Paris possesses one of these defensive weapons, 2 yards and a quarter in length and 15 inches in diameter at the base. Very well. Suppose this weapon would be 6 times stronger. Very well. Suppose this weapon to be 6 times stronger and the animal 10 times more powerful. Launch it at the rate of 20 miles an hour, and you obtain a shock capable of producing the catastrophe required. Upon further information, therefore, I shall maintain it to be a sea unicorn of colossal dimension, armed not with a halberd, but with a real spur, and the armored frigates, or the rams of war, whose massiveness and motive power it would possess at the same time. Thus may the puzzling phenomena be explained, unless there be something over and above that all that one has ever conjectured, seen, perceived, or experienced, which is just within the bounds of possibility. End quote. These last words were cowardly on my part, but up to a certain point I wished to shelter my dignity as professor and not give too much cause for laughter to the Americans, who laugh well when they do laugh. I reserved for myself a way of escape. In effect, however, I admitted the existence of the monster. My article was warmly discussed, which procured it a high reputation. It rallied around it a certain number of partisans. The solution it proposed gave at least full liberty to the imagination. The human mind delights in grand conceptions of supernatural beings, and the sea is precisely their best vehicle. The only medium, though, which these giants against which terrestrial animals, such as elephants or rhinoceroses, are as nothing, can be produced or developed. The industrial and commercial papers treated the question chiefly from this point of view. The Shipping and Mercantile Gazette, the Lloyd's List, the Packet Boat, and the Maritime and Colonial Review, all papers devoted to insurance companies which threatened to raise their rates of premium, were unanimous on this point. Public opinion had been pronounced. The United States were the first in the field, and in New York they made preparations for an expedition destined to pursue this narwhal. A frigate of great speed, the Abraham Lincoln, was put in commission as soon as possible. The arsenals were opened to Commander Farragut, who hastened the arming of his frigate, but, as it always happens, the moment it was decided to pursue the monster did not appear. For 2 months no one heard it spoken of. No ship met with it. It seemed as if this unicorn knew of the plots weaving around it. It had been so much talked of, even through the Atlantic cable, that pretended that gestures pretended that this slender fly had stopped a telegram on its passage and was making the most of it. So when the frigate had been armed for a long campaign and provided with formidable fishing apparatus, no one could tell that course to pursue. No one could tell what course to pursue. Impatience grew apace when on June 2 they learned that a steamer of the line of San Francisco from California to Shanghai had seen the animal 3 weeks before in the North Pacific Ocean. The excitement caused by the news was extreme. The ship was re-victualled and well stocked with coal. 3 hours before the Abraham Lincoln left Brooklyn Pier, I received a letter worded as follows. To Mr. Aronnax, Professor in the Museum of Paris, Fifth Avenue Hotel, New York. Sir, if you will consent to joining the Abraham Lincoln in this expedition, the government of the United States will with pleasure see France represented in the enterprise. Commander Farragut has a cabin at your disposal. Very cordially yours, J. B. Hobson, Secretary of Marine. Chapter 3. I form my resolution. 3 seconds before the arrival of J. B. Hobson's letter, I no more thought of pursuing the Unicorn than of attempting the passage of the North Sea. 3 seconds after reading the letter of the Honorable Secretary of Marine, I felt that my true vocation, the sole end of my life, was to chase this disturbing monster and purge it from the world. But I had just returned from a fatiguing journey, weary and longing for repose. I aspired to nothing more than again see my country, my friends, my little lodging by the Jardin des Plantes, my dear and precious collections, but nothing could keep me back. I forgot all, fatigue, friends, and collections, and accepted without hesitation the offer of the American government. Besides, thought I, all roads lead back to Europe, and the Unicorn may be amiable enough to hurry me towards the coast of France. This worthy animal may allow itself to be caught in the seas of Europe, for my particular benefit, and I will not bring back less than half a yard of his ivory halberd to the Museum of Natural History. But in the meanwhile I must seek this narwhal in the North Pacific Ocean, which, to return to France, was taking the road to the antipodes. Counsel, I called in an impatient voice. Consul was my servant, a true, devoted Flemish boy, who had accompanied me in all my travels. I liked him, and he returned the liking well. He was quiet by nature, regular from principle, zealous from habit, evincing little disturbance at the different surprises of life, very quick with his hands, and apt at any service required of him, and despite his name, never giving advice, even when asked for it. Consul had followed me for the last 10 years wherever science led. Never once did he complain of the length of the fatigue of a journey, never make an objection to pack his portmanteau for whatever country it might be, or however far away, whether China or Congo. Beside all this, he had good health, which defied all sickness, and solid muscles, but no nerves. Good morals are understood. This boy was 30 years old, and his age to that of his master as 15 to 20. May I be excused for saying that I was 40 years old? But Counsel had one fault. He was ceremonious to a degree, and would never speak to me but in the third person, which was sometimes provoking. Counsel, I said again, beginning with feverish hands to make preparations for my departure. Certainly I was sure of this devoted boy. As a rule, I never asked him if it were convenient for him or not to follow me in my travels. But this time the expedition in question might be prolonged, and the enterprise might be hazardous in pursuit of an animal capable of sinking a frigate as easily as a nutshell. But here there was a matter for reflection even to the most impassive man in the world. What would Counsel say? Counsel, I called a third time. Counsel appeared. Did you call, sir? He said, entering. Yes, my boy. Make preparations for me and yourself too. We leave in 2 hours. As you please, sir, replied Counsel quietly. Not an instant to lose. Lock in my trunk all traveling utensils, coats, shirts, and stockings, without counting, as many as you can, and make haste. And your collections, sir? Observed Counsel. We will think of them by and by. What? The Archaeotherium, the Hyracotherium, the Oreodons, the Cheropotamus, and the other skins? They will keep them at the hotel. We are not returning to Paris, then? Said Counsel. Oh, certainly, I answered evasively, by making a curve. Will the curve please you, sir? Oh, it will be nothing, not quite so direct a road, that is all. We take our passage in the Abraham Lincoln. As you think proper, sir, coolly replied Counsel. You see, my friend, it has to do with the monster, the famous narwhal. We are going to purge it from the seas. The author of a work in quarto, in 2 volumes, on the mysteries of the great submarine grounds cannot forbear embarking with Commander Farragut. A glorious mission, but a dangerous one. We cannot tell where we may go. These animals can be very capricious, but we will go whether or no we have got a captain who is pretty wide awake. I opened a credit account for Babirusa, and Counsel following, I jumped into a cab. Our luggage was transported to the deck of the frigate immediately. I hastened on board and asked for Commander Farragut. One of the sailors conducted me to the poop, where I found myself in the presence of a good-looking officer who held out his hand to me. Monsieur Pierre Aronnax, he said. Himself, I replied. Commander Farragut? You are welcome, Professor. Your cabin is ready for you. I bowed and desired to be conducted to the cabin destined for me. The Abraham Lincoln had been well chosen and equipped for her new destination. She was a frigate of great speed, fitted with high-pressure engines, which admitted a pressure of 7 atmospheres. Under this, the Abraham Lincoln attained the mean speed of nearly 18 knots and a third an hour. A considerable speed, but nevertheless insufficient to grapple with this gigantic crustacean. The interior arrangements of the frigate corresponded to its nautical qualities. I was well satisfied with my cabin, which was in the after part opening upon the gun-room. We shall be well off here, said I to Counsel. As well, by your honour's leave, as a hermit crab in the shell of a rock, said Counsel. I left Counsel to stow our trunks conveniently away, and remounted the poop in order to survey the preparations for departure. At that moment, Commander Farragut was ordering the last mooring to be cast loose which held the Abraham Lincoln to the pier of Brooklyn. So in a quarter of an hour, perhaps less, the frigate would have sailed without me. I should have missed this extraordinary, supernatural, and incredible expedition, the recital of which may well meet with some suspicion. But Commander Farragut would not lose a day nor an hour in scouring the sea in which the animal had been sighted. He sent for the engineer. "Is the steam full on?" asked he. "Yes, sir," replied the engineer. "Go ahead," cried Commander Farragut. The quay of Brooklyn and all that part of New York bordering on the East River was crowded with spectators. 3 cheers burst successively from 500,000 throats. Thousands of handkerchiefs were waved above the heads of the compact mass, saluting the Abraham Lincoln, until she reached the waters of the Hudson and the point of that elongated peninsula which forms the town of New York. Then the frigate, following the coast of New Jersey along the right bank of the beautiful river, covered with villas, passed between the forts, which saluted her with their heaviest guns. The Abraham Lincoln answered by hoisting the American colors 3 times, whose 39 stars shone resplendent from the mizzen peak, then modifying its speed to take the narrow channel marked by buoys placed in the inner bay formed by Sandy Hook Point. It coasted the long sandy beach, where some thousands of spectators gave it one final cheer. The escort of boats and tenders still followed the frigate, and did not leave her until they came abreast of the lightship, whose 2 lights marked the entrance of New York Channel. 6 bells struck. The pilot got into his boat and rejoined the little schooner, which was waiting under our lee. The fires were made up. The screw beat the waves more rapidly. The frigate skirted the low, yellow coast of Long Island, and at 8 bells, after having lost sight of the northwest of the lights of Fire Island, she ran at full steam onto the dark waters of the Atlantic. Chapter 4. Ned Land. Captain Farragut was a good seaman, worthy of the frigate he commanded. His vessel and he were one. He was the soul of it. On the question of the monster there was no doubt in his mind, and he would not allow the existence of the animal to be disputed on board. He believed in it, as certain good women believe in the Leviathan, by faith, not by reason. The monster did exist, and he had sworn to rid the seas of it. Either Captain Farragut would kill the narwhal, or the narwhal would kill the captain. There was no third course. The officers on board shared the opinion of their chief. They were even chatting, discussing, and calculating the various chances of a meeting, watching narrowly the vast surface of the ocean. More than one took up its quarters voluntarily in the cross trees. Who would have cursed such a berth under any circumstance? As long as the sun described its daily course, the rigging was crowded with sailors, whose feet were burned to such an extent by the heat of the deck as to render it unbearable. Still, the Abraham Lincoln had not yet breasted the suspected waters in the Pacific, and to the ship's company they desired nothing more than to meet the Unicorn, harpoon it, hoist it on the board, and dispatch it. They watched the sea with eager attention. Besides, Captain Farragut had spoken to a certain sum of $2,000 set apart from whoever should first sight the monster, were his cabin boy, common seaman, or officer. I leave you to judge how eyes were used on that board. I leave you to judge how eyes were used on board the Abraham Lincoln. For my own part, I was not behind the others, and left to no one my share of daily observations. The frigate might have been called the Argus for 100 reasons. Only one amongst us consul seemed to protest by his indifference against the question which has so interested us all, and seemed to be out of keeping with the general enthusiasm on board. I have said that Captain Farragut had carefully provided his ship with every apparatus for catching the giant crustacean. No whaler had ever been better armed. We possessed every known engine, from the harpoon thrown by the hand to the barbed arrows of the blunderbuss and the explosive balls of the duck gun. For on the forecastle lay the perfection of a breech-loading gun, very thick at the breech and very narrow in the bore, the model of which had been in the exhibition of 1867. This precious weapon of American origin could throw with ease a conical projection of 9 pounds to a mean distance of 10 miles. Thus, the Abraham Lincoln wanted for no means of destruction, and, what was better still, she had on board Ned Land, the prince of harpooners. Ned Land was a Canadian, with an uncommon quickness of hand, and who knew no equal in his dangerous occupation. Skill, coolness, audacity, and cunning he possessed in a superior degree, and it must be a cunning whale or a singularly, quote, cute, end quote, cachalot to escape the stroke of his harpoon. Ned Land was about 40 years of age. He was a tall man, more than 6 feet high, strongly built, grave, and taciturn, occasionally violent, and very passionate when contradicted. His person attracted attention. But above all the boldness of his look, which gave a singular expression to his face. Who calls himself Canadian calls himself French, and little communicative as Ned Land was, I must admit that he took a certain liking for me. My nationality drew him to me, no doubt. It was an opportunity for him to talk, and for me to hear, that old language of Rabelais, which is still in use in some Canadian provinces. The harpooner's family was originally from Quebec, and was already a tribe of hardy fishermen when this town belonged to France. Little by little, Ned Land acquired a taste for chatting, and I loved to hear the recital of his adventures in the polar seas. He related his fishing and his combats with natural poetry of expression. His recital took the form of an epic poem, and I seemed to be listening to a Canadian Homer singing the Iliad from the regions of the north. I am portraying this hardy companion as I really know him. We are old friends now, united in that unchangeable friendship which is born and cemented amid extreme dangers. Ah, brave Ned, I ask no more than to live 100 years longer, that I may have more time to dwell on the longer of your memory. Now, what was Ned Land's opinion upon the question of the marine monster? I must admit that he did not believe in the unicorn, and was the only one on board who did not share the universal conviction. He even avoided the subject, which I one day thought it my duty to press upon him. One magnificent evening, July 30, that is to say, 3 weeks after our departure, the frigate was abreast of Cape Blanc, 30 miles to leeward of the coast of Patagonia. We had crossed the Tropic of Capricorn, and the Straits of Magellan opened less than 700 miles to the south. Before 8 days were over, the Abraham Lincoln would be plowing the waters of the Pacific. Seated on the poop, Ned Land and I were chatting of one thing and another as we looked at this mysterious sea, whose great depths had up to this time been inaccessible to the eye of man. I naturally led up the conversation to the giant unicorn, and examined the various chances of success or failure of the expedition. But seeing that Ned Land let me speak without saying too much himself, I pressed him. But seeing that Ned Land let me speak without saying too much himself, I pressed him more closely. "Well, Ned," said I, "is it possible that you are not convinced of the existence of this cetacean that we are following? Have you any particular reason for being so incredulous?" The harpooner looked at me fixedly for some moments before answering, struck his broad forehead with his hand, a habit of his, as if to collect himself, and said at last, "Perhaps I have, Mr. Aronnax. But Ned, you, a whaler by profession, familiarized with all the great marine mammalia, you ought to be the last to doubt under such circumstances." "That is just what deceives you, Professor," replied Ned. "As a whaler, I have followed many a cetacean, harpooned a great number, and killed several, but however strong or well armed they may have been, neither their tails nor their weapons would have been able even to scratch the iron plates of a steamer. But, Ned, they tell of ships which the teeth of the narwhal have pierced through and through." "Wooden ships, that is possible," replied the Canadian, "but I have never seen it done, and until further proof, I deny that whales, cetaceans, or sea creatures, or sea unicorns, could ever produce the effect you described." "Well, Ned, I repeat it with a conviction resting on the logic of facts. I believe in the existence of a mammal power fully organized, belonging to the branch of the vertebrata, like the whales, the cachalots, or the dolphins, and furnished with a horn of defense of great penetrating power." Said the harpooner, shaking his head with the air of a man who would not be convinced. "Notice one thing, my worthy Canadian," I resumed. "If such an animal is in existence, if it inhabits the depths of the ocean, if it frequents the strata lying miles below the surface of the water, it must necessarily possess an organization the strength of which would defy all comparison." "And why this powerful organization?" demanded Ned. "Because it requires incalculable strength to keep one's self in these strata and resist their pressure. Listen to me. Let us admit that the pressure of the atmosphere is represented by the weight of a column of water 32 feet high. In reality, the column of water would be shorter, as we are speaking of seawater, the density of which is greater than that of fresh water. Very well, when you dive, Ned, as many times 32 feet of water as there are above you, so many times does your body bear a pressure equal to that of the atmosphere. That is to say, 15 pounds for each square inch of its surface. It follows, then, that at 32 feet this pressure equals that of 10 atmospheres, of 100 atmospheres at 3,200 feet, and of 1,000 atmospheres at 32,000 feet, that is, about 6 miles, which is equivalent to saying that if you could attain this depth in the ocean, each square 3/8 of an inch of the surface of your body would bear a pressure of 5,600 pounds. Ah, my brave Ned, do you know how many square inches you carry on the surface of your body?" "I have no idea, Mr. Aronnax." About 6,500, and as in reality the atmospheric pressure is about 15 pounds to the square inch, your 6,500 square inch bear at this moment a pressure of 97,500 pounds. Without my perceiving it? Without your perceiving it. And if you are not crushed by such a pressure, it is because the air penetrates the interior of your body with equal pressure. Hence, perfect equilibrium between the interior and exterior pressure, which thus neutralize each other and which allows you to bear it without inconvenience. But in the water it is another thing. Yes, I understand, replied Ned, becoming more attentive. Because the water surrounds me, but does not penetrate. Precisely, Ned. So that at 32 feet beneath the surface of the sea, you would undergo a pressure of 97,500 pounds. At 320 feet, 10 times that pressure. At 3,200 feet, 100 times that pressure. Lastly, at 32,000 feet, 1,000 times that pressure would be 97,500,000 pounds. That is to say, that you would be flattened as if you had been drawn from the plates of a hydraulic machine. The devil, exclaimed Ned. Very well, my worthy harpooner. If some vertebrate several hundred yards long and large in proportion can maintain itself in such depths of those whose surface is represented by millions of square inches, that is, by tens of millions of pounds, we must estimate the pressure they undergo. Consider, then, what must be the resistance of their bony structure and the strength of their organization to withstand such pressure. Why, exclaimed Ned Land, they must be made of iron plates, 8 inches thick, like the armored frigates. As you say, Ned, and think what destruction such a mass would cause if hurled with the speed of an express train against the hull of a vessel. Yes, certainly, perhaps, replied the Canadian, shaken by these figures, but not yet willing to give in. Well, have I convinced you? You have convinced me of one thing, sir, which is that, if such animals do exist at the bottom of the sea, they must necessarily be as strong as you say. But if they do not exist, mine obstinate harpooner, how explain the accident to the Scotia? Chapter 5. At a Venture. The voyage of the Abraham Lincoln was for a long time marked by no special incident. But one circumstance happened which showed the wonderful dexterity of Ned Land and proved what confidence we might place on him. On June 30, the frigate spoke with some American whalers, from whom we learned that they knew nothing about the narwhal. But one of them, the captain of the Monroe, knowing that Ned Land had shipped on board the Abraham Lincoln, begged for his help in chasing a whale they had in sight. Commander Farragut, desirous of seeing Ned Land at work, gave him permission to go on board the Monroe. And fate served our Canadian so well that, instead of one whale, he harpooned 2 with a double blow, striking one straight to the heart, and catching the other after some minutes' pursuit. Decidedly, if the monster ever had to do with Ned Land's harpoon, I would not bet in its favor. The frigate skirted the southeast coast of America with great rapidity. On July 3, we were at the opening of the Straits of Magellan, level with Cape Vierges. But Commander Farragut would not take a tortuous passage, but doubled Cape Horn. The ship's crew agreed with him, and certainly it was possible that they might meet the narwhal in this narrow pass. Many of the sailors affirmed that the monster could not pass there, quote, that he was too big for that, end quote. On July 6, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Abraham Lincoln, at 15 miles to the south, doubled the solitary island, this lost rock at the extremity of the American continent, to which some Dutch sailors gave the name of their native town, Cape Horn. The course was taken towards the northeast, and the next day the screw of the frigate was at last beating the waters of the Pacific. "Keep your eyes open," called out the sailors, and they were opened widely, both eyes and glasses, a little dazzled, it is true, by the prospect of $2,000, had not an instant's repose. Day and night we watched the surface of the ocean, and even nyctalopes, whose faculty of seeing the darkness multiplies their chance 100-fold, would have had enough to do to gain the prize. I myself, for whom money had no charms, was not the least attentive on board. Given but few minutes to my meals, but a few hours to sleep, indifferent to either rain or sunshine, I did not leave the poop of the vessel, now leaning on the netting of the forecastle, now on the taffrail. I devoured with eagerness the soft foam which whitened the sea as far as the eye could reach, and how often have I shared the emotion of the majority of the crew, where some capricious whale raised its black back above the waves. The poop of the vessel was crowded on a moment. The cabins poured forth a torrent of sailors and officers, each with heaving breasts and troubled eye, watching the course of the cetacean. I looked and I looked till I was nearly blind, while Consul kept repeating in a calm voice, "If, sir, you would not squint so much, you would see better." But vain excitement. The Abraham Lincoln checked its speed and made for the animal signaled, a simple whale, or common cachalot, which soon disappeared amid a storm of abuse. But the weather was good. The voyage was being accomplished under the most favorable auspices. It was then the bad season in Australia, the July of that zone corresponding to our January in Europe, but the sea was beautiful and easily scanned around a vast circumference. On July 20, the Tropic of Capricorn was cut by 105 degrees of longitude, and the 27th of the same month we crossed the equator on the 110th meridian. This passed, the frigate took a more decided westerly direction and scoured the central waters of the Pacific. Commander Farragut thought, and with reason, that it was better to remain in deep water and keep clear of continents or islands, which the beast itself seemed to shun. Perhaps because there was not enough water for him, suggested the greater part of the crew. The frigate passed at some distance from the Marquesas and the Sandwich Islands, crossed the Tropic of Cancer, and made for the China Seas. We were on the theater of the last diversions of the monster, and, to say truth, we no longer lived on board. The entire ship's crew were undergoing a nervous excitement of which I can give no idea. They could not eat, they could not sleep 20 times a day, a misconception or an optical illusion of some sailor seated on the taffrail would cause dreadful perspirations. And those emotions, 20 times repeated, kept us in a state of excitement so violent that a reaction was unavoidable. And truly, reaction soon showed itself. For 3 months, during which a day seemed an age, the Abraham Lincoln furrowed all the waters of the northern Pacific, running at whales, making sharp deviations from her course, veering suddenly from one tack to another, stopping suddenly, putting on steam, and backing ever and anon at the risk of deranging her machinery, and not one point of the Japanese or American coast was left unexplored. The warmest partisans of the enterprise now became its most ardent detractors. Reaction mounted from the crew to the captain himself, and certainly, had it not been for the resolute determination on the part of Captain Farragut, the frigate would have headed due southward. This useless search could not last much longer. The Abraham Lincoln had nothing to reproach herself with. She had done her best to succeed. Never had an American ship's crew shown more zeal or patience. Its failure could not be placed to their charge. There remained nothing but to return. This was represented to the commander. The sailors could not hide their discontent, and the service suffered. I will not say there was a mutiny on board, but after a reasonable period of obstinacy, Captain Farragut, as Columbus did, asked for 3 days' patience. If in 3 days the monster did not appear, the man at the helm should give 3 turns of the wheel, and the Abraham Lincoln would make for European seas. This promise was made on November 2. It had the effect of rallying the ship's crew. The ocean was watched with renewed attention. Each one wished for a last glance in which to sum up his remembrance. Glasses were used with feverish activity. It was a grand defiance given to the giant narwhal, as he could scarcely fail to answer the summons and appear. 2 days passed. The steam was half pressure. 1,000 schemes were tried to attract the attention and stimulate the apathy of the animal in case it should be met in those parts. Large quantities of bacon were trailed in the wake of the ship, to the great satisfaction, I must say, of the sharks. Small craft radiated in all directions around the Abraham Lincoln as she lay to, and did not leave a spot to the sea unexplored. But the night of November 4 arrived without the unveiling of this submarine mystery. The next day, November 5, at 12, the delay would, morally speaking, expire. After that time, Commander Farragut, faithful to his promise, was to turn the course to the southeast and abandon forever the northern regions of the Pacific. The frigate was then in 31 degree 15 minute north latitude and 136 degree 42 minute east longitude. The coast of Japan still remained less than 200 miles to leeward. Night was approaching. They had just struck 8 bells. Large clouds veiled the face of the moon, and in its first quarter. They had just struck 8 bells. Large clouds veiled the face of the moon, then in its first quarter. The sea undulated peaceably under the stern of the vessel. At that moment I was leaning forward on the starboard netting. Consul, standing next to me, was looking straight before him. The crew, perched on the ratlines, examined the horizon, which contracted and darkened by degree. Officers, with their night glasses, scoured the growing darkness. Sometimes the ocean sparkled under the rays of the moon, which darted between 2 clouds. Then all trace of light was lost in the darkness. In looking at Consul, I could see he was undergoing a little of the general influence. At least I thought so. Perhaps for the first time his nerves vibrated to a sentiment of curiosity. "Come, Consul," said I. "This is the last chance of pocketing the $2,000. "May I be permitted to say, sir," replied Consul, "that I never reckoned on getting the prize, and had the government of the United offered $100,000, it would have been none the poorer." "You are right, Consul. It's a foolish affair after all, and one upon which we entered too lightly. What time lost! What useless emotions! We should have been back in France 6 months ago." "In your little room, sir," replied Consul, "and in your museum, sir. And I should have already classed all your fossils, sir. And the Babirusa would have been installed in its cage in the Jardin des Plantes, and all the and have drawn all the curious people of the capital. As you say, Consul, I fancy we shall run a fair chance of being laughed at for our plans, for our pains. That's tolerably certain, replied Consul quietly. I think they will make fun of you, sir. And, must I say it? Go on, my good friend. Well, sir, you will only get your deserts. Indeed. When one has the honor of being a savant as you are, sir, one should not expose one's self to... Consul had no time to finish his compliment. In the midst of general silence, a voice had just been heard. It was the voice of Ned Land shouting, "Look out there! The very thing we are looking for! On our weather beam!" Chapter 6. At full steam. At this cry, the whole ship's crew hurried towards the harpooner. Commander, officers, masters, sailors, cabin boys, even the engineers left their engines, and the stokers their furnaces. The order to stop her had been given, and the frigate now simply went on by her own momentum. The darkness was then profound, and however good the Canadian's eyes were, I asked myself how he had managed to see, and what he had been able to see. My heart beat as if it would break, but Ned Land was not mistaken, and we all perceived the object he pointed to. At 2 cables' length from the Abraham Lincoln, on the starboard quarter, the sea seemed to be illuminated all over. It was not a mere phosphoric phenomena. The monster emerged some fathoms from the water, and then threw out that very intense but mysterious light mentioned in the report of several captains. This magnificent irradiation must have been produced by an agent of great shining power. The luminous part traced on the sea an immense oval, much elongated, the center of which condensed a burning heat. Those overpowering brilliancy died out by the successive gradations. "It is only a messaging of phosphoric particles," cried one of the officers. "No, sir, certainly not," I replied. "That brightness is of an essentially electric nature. Besides, see, it moves. It is moving forward, backward. It is darting towards us." A general cry arose from the frigate. "Silence," said the captain. "Up with the helm, reverse the engines." The steam was shut off, and the Abraham Lincoln, beating to port, described a semicircle. "Right the helm, go ahead," cried the captain. These orders were executed, and the frigate moved rapidly from the burning light. I was mistaken. She tried to sheer off, but the supernatural animal approached with a velocity double her own. We gasped for breath. Stupefaction more than fear made us dumb and motionless. The animal gained on us, sporting with the waves. It made the round of the frigate, which was then making 14 knots, and enveloped it with its electric rings like luminous dust. Then it moved away 2 or 3 miles, leaving a phosphorescent track, like those volumes of steam that the express trains leave behind. All at once, from the dark line of the horizon, whither it retired to gain its momentum, the monster rushed suddenly towards the Abraham Lincoln with alarming rapidity, stopped suddenly about 20 feet from the hull, and died out, not diving under the water, for its brilliance did not abate, but suddenly, and as if the source of this brilliant emanation was exhausted. Then it reappeared on the other side of the vessel, as if it had turned and slid under the hull. Any moment a collision might have occurred, which would have been fatal to us. However, I was astonished at the maneuvers of the frigate. She fled and did not attack. On the captain's face, generally so impassive, was an expression of unaccountable astonishment. "Mr. Aronnax," he said, "I do not know with what formidable being I have to deal, and I will not imprudently risk my frigate in the middle of this darkness. Besides, how attack this unknown thing? How defend one's self from it? Wait for daylight, and the scenes will change. You have no further doubt, Captain, of the nature of the animal? No, sir. It is evidently a gigantic narwhal, and an electric one. Perhaps, added I, one can only approach it with a torpedo. Undoubtedly, replied the captain. If it possesses such dreadful power, it is the most terrible animal that ever was created. It is the most terrible animal that ever was created. That is why, sir, I must be on my guard. The crew were on their feet all night. No one thought of sleep. The Abraham Lincoln, not being able to struggle with such velocity, had moderated its pace and sailed at half speed. For its part, the narwhal, imitating the frigate, let the waters rocket at will, seemed decided not to leave the scene of the struggle. Towards midnight, however, it disappeared, or, to use a more appropriate term, it died out, quote unquote, like a large glowworm. Had it fled? One could only fear, not hope it. But at 7 minutes to 1 o'clock in the morning, a deafening whistling was heard, like that produced by a body of water rushing with great violence. The captain, Ned Land, and I were then on the poop, eagerly peering through the profound darkness. Ned Land, asked the commander, you have often heard the roaring of whales? Often, sir, but never such whales the sight of which brought me in $2,000. If I can only approach within 4 harpoons' length of it. But to approach it, said the commander, I ought to put a whaler at your disposal? Certainly, sir. That it will be trifling with the lives of my men. And mine too, simply said the harpooner. Towards 2 o'clock in the morning, the burning light reappeared, not less intense, about 5 miles to windward of the Abraham Lincoln. Notwithstanding the distance and the noise of the wind and sea, one heard distinctly the loud strokes of the animal's tail, and even its panting breath. It seemed that, at the moment that the enormous narwhal had come to take breath at the surface of the water, the air was engulfed in its lungs, like the steam in the vast cylinders of a machine of 2,000 horsepower. Thought I. A whale with the strength of a cavalry regiment would be pretty whale. Thought I. A whale with the strength of a cavalry regiment would be a pretty whale. We were on the qui vive till daylight, and prepared for the combat. The fishing implements were laid along the hammock nettings. The second lieutenant loaded the blunderbusses, which could throw harpoons to the distance of a mile, and long duck guns with explosive bullets, which inflicted mortal wounds even to the most terrible animals. Ned Land contented himself with sharpening his harpoon, a terrible weapon in his hands. At 6 o'clock day began to break, and with the first glimmer of light, the electric light of the narwhal disappeared. At 7 o'clock the day was sufficiently advanced, but a very thick sea fog obscured our view, and the best spy-glasses could not pierce it. That caused disappointment and anger. I climbed the mizzen-mast. Some officers were already perched on the mastheads. At 8 o'clock the fog lay heavy on the waves, and thick squalls rose little by little. The horizon grew wider and clearer at the same time. Suddenly, just as on the day before, Ned Land's voice was heard. "The thing itself on the port quarter," cried the harpooner. Every eye was turned towards the point indicated. There, a mile and a half from the frigate, a long blackish body emerged a yard above the waves. Its tail, violently agitated, produced a considerable eddy. Never did a tail beat the sea with such violence. An immense track of dazzling whiteness marked the passage of the animal and described a long curve. The frigate approached the cetacean. I examined it thoroughly. The reports of the Shannon and of the Helvetia had rather exaggerated its size, and I estimated its length at only 250 feet. As to its dimensions, I would only conjecture them to be admirably proportioned. While I watched this phenomena, 2 jets of steam and water were ejected from its vents, and rose to the height of 120 feet. Thus I ascertained its way of breathing. I concluded definitely that it belonged to the vertebrate branch, class Mammalia. The crew waited impatiently for their chief's orders. The latter, after having observed the animal attentively, called the engineer. The engineer ran up to him. "Sir," said the commander, "you have steam up?" "Yes, sir," answered the engineer. "Well, make up your fires and put on all steam." 3 hurrahs greeted this order. The time for the struggle had arrived. Some moments after, the 2 funnels of the frigate vomited torrents of black smoke, and the bridge quaked under the trembling of the boilers. The Abraham Lincoln, propelled by her wonderful screw, went straight at the animal. The latter allowed it to come within half a cable's length. Then, as if disdaining to dive, it took a little turn and stopped a short distance off. This pursuit lasted nearly 3/4 of an hour, without the frigate gaining 2 yards on the cetacean. It was quite evident that at that rate we should never come up with it. "Well, Mr. Land," asked the captain, "do you advise me to put the boats out to sea?" "No, sir," replied Ned Land, "because we shall not take that beast easily." "What shall we do then?" "Put on more steam if you can, sir. With your leave, I mean to post myself under the bowsprit, and if we get within harpooning distance, I shall throw my harpoon." "Go, Ned," said the captain. "Engineer, put on more pressure." Ned Land went to his post. The fires were increased. The screw revolved 43 times a minute, and the steam poured out of the valves. We heaved the log, and calculated that the Abraham Lincoln was going at the rate of 18.5 miles an hour. But the accursed animal swam at the same speed. For a whole hour the frigate kept up this pace, without gaining 6 feet. It was humiliating for one of the swiftest sailors of the American Navy. A stubborn anger seized the crew. The sailors abused the monster, who, as before, disdained to answer them. The captain no longer content himself with twisting his beard, he gnawed it. The engineer was called again. You have turned full steam on?" "Yes, sir," replied the engineer. The speed of the Abraham Lincoln increased. Its masts trembled down to their stepping stone, and the clouds of smoke could hardly find way out of the narrow funnels. They heaved the log a second time. "Well?" asked the captain of the man at the wheel. 19 miles and 3/10, sir." "Clap one more steam." The engineer obeyed. The manometer showed 10 degrees, but the cetacean grew warm itself, no doubt, for without straining itself, it made 19 3/10 miles. What a pursuit! No, I cannot describe the emotion that vibrated through me. Ned Land kept his post, harpoon in hand. Several times the animal let us gain upon him. "We shall catch it! We shall catch it!" cried the Canadian. But just as he was going to strike, the cetacean stole away with a rapidity that could not be estimated at less than 30 miles an hour, and even during our maximum of speed, it bullied the frigate, going around and around it. A cry of fury broke from everyone. At noon, we were no further advanced than at 8 o'clock in the morning. The captain then decided to take more direct means. "Ah," he said, That animal goes quicker than the Abraham Lincoln. Very well. We will see whether it will escape these conical bullets. Send your men to the forecastle, sir. The forecastle gun was immediately loaded and slewed around, but the shot passed some feet above the cetacean, which was half a mile off. Another, more to the right, cried the commander, and $5 to whoever will hit that infernal beast. An old gunner with a gray beard, that I can see now, with steady eyes and grave face, went up to the gun and took a long aim. A loud report was heard, while with which were mingled the cheers of the crew. The bullet did its work. It hit the animal, and sliding off the rounded surface, was lost in 2 miles' depth of sea. The chase began again, and the captain, leaning towards me, said, "I will pursue that beast till my frigate bursts up." Bursts up. "Yes," answered I, "and you will be quite right to do it. I wish the beast would exhaust itself, and not be insensible to fatigue like a steam engine." But it was of no use. Hours passed without its showing any signs of exhaustion. However, it must be said in praise of the Abraham Lincoln that she struggled on indefatigably. I cannot reckon the distance she made under 300 miles during this unlucky day, November 6, but night came on and overshadowed the rough ocean. Now I thought our expedition was at an end, and that we should never again see the extraordinary animal. I was mistaken. At 10 minutes to 11 in the evening, the electric light reappeared 3 miles to windward of the frigate, as pure, as intense as during the preceding night. The narwhal seemed motionless, perhaps tired with its day's work. It slept, letting itself float with the undulation of the waves. Now what a chance of which the captain resolved to take advantage. He gave his orders. The Abraham Lincoln kept up half steam and advanced cautiously so as not to awaken its adversary. It is no rare thing to meet in the middle of the ocean whales so sound asleep that they can be successfully attacked, and Ned Land had harpooned more than one during his sleep. The Canadian went on to take his place again under the bowsprit. The frigate approached noiselessly, stopped at 2 cables' length from the animal, and followed its track. No one breathed. A deep silence reigned on the bridge. We were not 100 feet from the burning focus, the light of which increased and dazzled our eyes. At this moment, leaning on the forecastle bulwark, I saw below me Ned Land grappling the martingale in one hand, brandishing his terrible harpoon in the other, scarcely 20 feet from the motionless animal. Suddenly his arm straightened, and the harpoon was thrown. I heard the sonorous stroke of the weapon, which seemed to have struck a hard body. The electric light went out suddenly, and 2 enormous waterspouts broke over the bridge of the frigate, rushing like a torrent from stem to stern, overthrowing men and breaking the lashings of the spars. A fearful shock followed, and thrown over the rail without having time to stop myself, I fell into the sea.